I understand that this is your third visit to the United States in as many months.
Yes.
Your most recent visit was...
And I'm not sure whether that's good or bad.
Your most recent visit was just last month for an ASEAN foreign ministers meeting hosted by Secretary Tillerson.
That's right.
And you've made this trip, the third trip,
just for you.
For us. So thank you very, very much. I think the fact that you've done so is really reflective of AJC's warm relationship with Singapore. It reflects also our appreciation and recognition of the importance of your friendship with the United States, with Israel, and your importance in a region of expanding importance in the world. There are many, many subjects that we need to cover tonight, that we'd like to cover in limited time. I'd like to first, before we delve into the questions, offer you an opportunity to set the stage for us and let us know what's on your mind.
Right. Let me quickly first tell you how small Singapore is. I don't know how many of you have been there. We're about 2/3 the size of New York City, or 1/12 the size of Cyprus.
Small.
We have only been independent for 51 years. But the story of Jews in Singapore actually goes back 200 years. And for some reason, which I haven't been able to figure out yet, the early families, the Jewish families in Singapore 200 years ago, all came from Baghdad. I haven't figured why. And they were illustrious, hardworking, high-achieving, but I guess that's standard, right, for all Jews all over the world. And in fact, so much so that when the British started with self-government for Singapore in the 50s, the first chief minister of Singapore was a Baghdadi Jew, David Saul Marshall. I'm not sure how many other countries can claim that.
Not many.
Right? Not many. Then after we got full independence in 1965, and we needed to establish an armed forces, my founding Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, wrote a letter to several countries. I won't name them out of embarrassment, because only one country replied. Guess who? Israel. And I share this story because, again, it illustrates the point that a friend in need is a friend indeed. And that has been one key reason for this very close, intimate relationship that we've had with Israel for all these years. Because when we were small and inconsequential and didn't matter, you didn't ignore us. The other point is that over the years, obviously the relationship has grown. It's had to be somewhat low profile because we live in a, how shall I put it, an interesting and sometimes tough neighborhood. Not as tough as Israel, but challenging enough. And the first visit by an Israeli head of state, Prime Minister Netanyahu, occurred just earlier this year. And in fact, my Prime Minister, for the first time, paid a visit as the Prime Minister to Israel in April last year. And I thought I'd share with you some personal reflections. It was a very moving visit, profound visit for me. We started off in Jordan. We went up to Mount Nebo to just get some idea of what the Promised Land could have looked like. I think it was very dry.
Different than in...
We then went to the Jordan River, the baptismal site, El Baktas, crossed the Allenbury Bridge, went to Jerusalem, saw the Western Wall, went up onto Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then the other parts of the Old City, Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, it may surprise you, but even for an Asian, I'm of mixed ancestry, Indian and Chinese. It was a profoundly moving experience. But one point which kept reverberating in my mind as I was up on Temple Mount was how much blood must have been shed over millennia for that holy site. And it humbled me because, the trouble with diplomats is we think everything can be solved. It's a form of words, negotiation. And it humbled me that it's not so simple. Life is going to be a challenge. And the second thought, which has been buzzing in my mind, is that if you think about the story of the Jewish people and the enormous suffering that you have sustained, one key lesson, I believe, which is perhaps even more relevant today, is that identity is unique and not universal. Meaning, yes, we're all created in the image of God, but we all have unique identities. And one special magic about the Jewish people is that you've been able to keep your identity, despite being actually a very small group, despite enormous trials and tribulations. You've kept that identity. And the second point is that if you look at the suffering and your survival, it's a reminder that we need to have universal protection of minorities. And if you fast forward to the world of today, see, for most of human history, we've lived surrounded by people who are related to us, looked like us, smelled like us, ate like us, prayed to the same God. But now in this day and age, the internet and jet travel, suddenly all of us are now acutely aware that we're a minority. It applies particularly in Singapore because although 75% of the population have ancestry from China, another 6-7% from India, and 15% from the Malay archipelago, as far as religion is concerned, everyone is a minority. And I can't help reflecting that even as today, as I'm sure we can talk about terrorism, fundamentalism, and the rest of it. But in fact, one key story, or one key lesson that the Jewish story has for the world is the importance of protecting minorities, of respecting the need for a unique identity, and at the same time, having universal respect. And if we can learn that right lesson, many of the challenges that we face can be solved.
That's certainly a principle that AJC upholds, not only in Asia, but around the world. So
yes. No, and for me, again, I couldn't help noticing that we started off with the Star-Spangled Banner. And here we are in the AJC, and you're all singing it.
We're an American organization.
Exactly, exactly. No, so the point is this, you see, that we all have multiple identities, and people should not be forced to choose one or the other. And that, again, is the problem with extremism.
I'd like to pick up on your first point when you were speaking about the important visits to the reciprocal visits of the prime ministers. Yes. About a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, Prime Minister Lee to Israel, and then more recently in February, Prime Minister Netanyahu to Singapore. It's a very significant visit. It was the first time for an Israeli prime minister to be in Singapore. Could you talk a little bit about the significance of that visit and some of the accomplishments from it and some of the sensitivities around it?
Well, first, the sensitivities. I mean, as I said just now, we've had a long relationship, and it's been a relationship grounded on strategic trust. Clearly, there's been training. I mean, I myself have had the privilege of being trained by, we used to call them Israeli advisors. In fact, I'll tell you, in 1965, we used to call the Israeli advisors Mexicans. That was the code word. I'm not sure how the administration would view that today. But again, it comes back to my point about respecting minorities. So yes, it has been sensitive. So it's taken us several decades before we could have a sitting Prime Minister of Singapore and a sitting Prime Minister of Israel exchange visits. The significance is that I believe Asia has moved on and our neighbors are able to accept the fact that we have a special relationship and that it's based on trust and it's a constructive relationship. There are many things that we admire about Israel. I mean, if you look, say, at the startup scene, Israel has only a population of about 8 million, but the startups, just in 2015 alone, were able to attract something like $2.6 billion in venture capital. To put things in context, Germany, which has 10 times the population of Israel, the startups were able to attract venture capital of $2.9 billion US dollars. The point here is that Israel, for some reason, always manages to punch above its weight. And it's no surprise, therefore, that we've got investments in Israeli startups. Israeli companies, I think there are about 400 or more, are based in Singapore. And they're really using the presence in Singapore as a portal, as an interface with Southeast Asia and beyond. So the point is that there has been, over many decades, an exchange of ideas, personnel, of talent, military, academic, startups, entrepreneurs. And this is something which we want to encourage and to continue to build. And the other point is, because we live in a part of the world where there is actually a Muslim majority around, we also hope that this will also eventually help build confidence, help build trust. And Prime Minister Netanyahu indicated that Israel is also looking for avenues to engage and expand interactions on a larger stage, to get beyond the zero-sum games, the lack of trust.
With Singapore as a gateway?
Yes, into the rest of Asia. So that's what we're offering. You can come to Singapore, you would feel at home. The synagogues are there, they're functional, you can do everything that you want there. You can celebrate all the festivals, including the Passover and Yom Kippur. And you are also integrated into a multicultural, multiracial country, and you have access to the region.
As you know, AJC delegations have visited Singapore
Yes.
over the last decade, and we hope to visit again very soon.
Soon.
Yes. I'd like to turn a little bit to the U.S.-Singapore relationship.
Yes.
Your colleague, Ambassador Kausikan, has said that in Asia, trade is strategy.
Yes.
And not so long ago, the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a great blow to Singapore, which was spearheading the negotiations that led to it. And it was a blow to many other countries who were signatories, including Japan and Vietnam, whose leaders put a lot of political capital on signing on to that agreement. AJC supported the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We believed that it was favorable to the United States,
Yes.
and as importantly, or more importantly, that it demonstrated American leadership and commitment in the region. The United States has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and
Unfortunately.
I think that we would appreciate hearing your perspective on what that means and what the future holds.
Well, let me give you a very frank response. It's a great disappointment. But from a Singapore perspective, first let me speak as Singapore. We've actually had a free trade agreement with the United States since 2004. In this period of time, the United States exports to Singapore, as far as services are concerned, have doubled, goods at least 75%. When my Prime Minister spoke to President Trump, we took pains to remind President Trump the United States runs a big surplus against Singapore. But we're not complaining. The reason we're not complaining is because we believe that free trade and economic integration, creating interdependence, collaboration, and win-win outcomes is the way to secure peace and prosperity. And you must understand, I say this as a country where trade is 3.5 times our GDP. So for us, this is not a debating point or a posture on stage. Trade is our lifeblood. So yes, we were key advocates, believers in the TPP, not because it gave us any, the benefits to Singapore would have been marginal because we already have a bilateral, and as I said, it's been doing well. But we believed in a multilateral regional TPP with key American participation because it signaled American engagement with the Asia Pacific.
Which we now don't have.
And that's where all the many of you in this audience must be businessmen. You know that there are enormous opportunities in Asia, and even in Southeast Asia. When Vice President Trump went to Jakarta, I think 2 months ago, he made a speech and he said, look, more than $100 billion worth of US exports, goods and services, go to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia supports about 500,000 jobs back home. American investment in Southeast Asia now runs at about $270 billion US dollars. The amazing thing is that America has more invested in Southeast Asia than it has combined in India, China, and Japan. I was shocked. There's actually more in Southeast Asia than you have invested in India, China, and Japan. So the point is, there are enormous opportunities out there. And for America not to take full advantage of that, to enter into a multilateral win-win regional trade agreement, to me, it's a great pity. You're missing out on an opportunity. But actually, beyond just the dollars and cents in the business, we believe this is of strategic importance. In fact, the strategy is more important than the economics, and certainly more important than military dimension. Because again, if you think about it, there's no reason for a 7th Fleet unless you've got something to defend. And we are past the age of colonization. What we are now is in the age, the real benefits of globalization is when we reach the age of interdependence, when it is in our mutual interests to invest in each other, to have good relations, to build up trust, to build up collaboration. So we think it's a great pity because it's a missed opportunity to build an architecture, inclusive, fair, and open architecture, which we believe would have secured the peace and prosperity for both America and for Asia. That's the biggest loss.
The U.S. is not a signatory now. So people say that it creates an opening for China. People say that it is a retreat of the United States. It is not demonstrating a commitment to the region. What are the steps? We have withdrawn from it? What are
the first thing I would put it is not to look at it as a zero-sum game or as a pure contest between the United States and China. Because separately, the ASEAN countries are negotiating with China, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand for another large regional free trade agreement called the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We love acronyms in Asia. This...
A Chinese initiative.
No, it's an ASEAN initiative. And what it does is that ASEAN already has free trade agreements with these 6 partners. And we're putting it together into one large mother free trade agreement. It will include probably about 45% of the world's population, 1/3 of the world's GDP. It will not be as ambitious as the TPP, but in terms of scope, it's even wider than the TPP. But Singapore has participated actively in both of these because we try to avoid zero-sum games. What we were really after was to put these 2 pieces together, the TPP and the RCEP, and construct a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. Again, it comes back to our fundamental belief on creating interdependence, mutual investments, as a recipe for peace and prosperity. And that, again, so yes, it's a pity the United States has pulled out, but the remaining members of the TPP are exploring ways to continue, to go ahead, to ratify, and if everyone can agree to proceed without them opening up the text, we will happily sign on to the TPP 11. But we will still hope that at some point, good sense will prevail, and the United States will realize it's in your own enlightened long-term self-interest to come back.
I'm going to stay on the topic of U.S. commitment just a little bit longer.
Yes.
AJC travels regularly to Asia. Since I've been the director of the Asia Pacific Institute, we've had many delegations to many countries in Asia, and consistently the subject of the U.S. commitment to the region has come up. And to be fair, this was formerly under the Obama administration, and more recently during the presidential election, and then with President-elect Trump. During the election, there were statements, bombastic statements that were made. There were statements distancing ourselves from our traditional allies. With the new administration, there has been some distancing, some reassurances that have been given by President Trump, as well as by visits by Secretary Mattis, by Secretary Tillerson. Singapore's reading of this, are you confident in the U.S. maintaining a robust presence and interest in your region?
Well, let me take a step back. And if you look at the period from the end of the Second World War until today, we've had 70 years where you saw the Berlin Wall fall. You saw the clear benefits of free markets, open economies, global integration. So much so that in 1989 or early 90s, I think Francis Fukuyama declared it the end of history, which of course was hubris. But the point is that these 70 years have actually been a golden age. Not absolute peace, but certainly for Asia, we've had peace, we've had prosperity. If you look at what's happened in China and in India, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted from abject poverty. And because we are interdependent on each other, it really doesn't make sense for major conflict to occur. Having said that, I think the problem for those of us who are advocates for free trade is that we have not paid enough attention to the asymmetrical impact it has on different segments of society. That means there are some people at a local level who are at risk of being left behind, or who are not equipped or trained or qualified to harvest the fruits of this brave new integrated world. And here's where we need to get the balance between domestic policies to make sure no one is left behind, and get that balance with open and free trade on an international level. So I think what we're seeing right now is there is a mood in many societies of anxiety, of fear, of envy. Middle-class wages have stagnated. Many middle-class white-collar jobs are disappearing, not because of trade, but actually because of technology. And because politicians and our responses have not been sufficiently convincing and reassuring to the local populations. There has been a revolt, there has been a retreat from globalization. Our anxiety is that we will end up with the worst of both worlds. Right? You will reject free trade and economic integration with all the benefits that brings to peace and prosperity. And at the same time, it's easy to express anger, much harder to restructure the economies, retool your people, provide new skills, change your education system. In fact, again, we'll take the Industrial Revolution for 250 years old. But the education as we know it only really transformed in the late 1865 to the early 1900s. So we changed our education systems to meet the challenge of the Industrial Revolution. We now have a digital revolution, and I think we have not transformed our education systems radically and quickly enough. If you take another example from the end of the Second World War, there were two key things. The US had the GI Bill, which provided education to all the returning veterans. And that led to a golden age because they were given new skills and they were able to harvest the fruits of the post-Second World War. And that's why you saw middle-class wages improving. The other key thing that happened after the Second World War was the Marshall Plan, which again uplifted. In fact, it's ironic that the so-called losers of the war, Japan and Germany, and a lot of Europe, in fact, were key beneficiaries of this Marshall Plan. The point here for both the GI Bill and the Marshall Plan is uplifting people by giving them skills, qualifications which are relevant and meet the challenges of the time. We believe that we are at such a moment, an inflection point. There's a new revolution, there are new requirements for education, skills, and training. If we make the right choices and prepare our people and make sure the safety nets are in place, and we don't give up on free markets, open economies, and economic integration, then perhaps we'll see a new golden age. But it's very hard. I mean, we can discuss it here. It's very hard to stand at a political rally and win votes on this kind of arguments. But in Singapore, that's what we are focused on. Our strong domestic focus is on economic restructuring, trying to decide where the new jobs are, what kind of startups will have a chance, what new technologies. We're investing heavily in infrastructure, connectivity, broadband, whatever else. I mean, in Singapore, because we are so small, it's easy for me to guarantee you that you'll have the best infrastructure in the world. Then we're reworking our education system so that it deals not only with kids preparing for pre-employment, but dealing with adults who need to get a second job or a third job, because it's likely that all of us will have multiple jobs in the future.
Minister, I'm going to, we are running out of time, and still I have a long list of things that I wish that I could cover with you, but I would be remiss if I do not ask a question about China. Before we leave, your predecessor, Foreign Minister Shanmugam, was on this stage, and he spent a great deal of time talking about China and the attention that needs to be paid to China. Could you comment on that and then perhaps make some concluding remarks about China, the China-US relationship, and how it fits in with Singapore and ASEAN?
What do the Chinese people and the Jewish people have in common? An identity which transcends thousands of years. And in fact, 1,000 years ago, if you ask which civilization had paper, the printing press, gunpowder, the sextant, ocean-going fleets, it was China. China missed out on the Industrial Revolution, and because of that, it went through 2 centuries of humiliation. It's not going to make that same mistake again. So what does China want? China wants to be number 1 again. When China was strong and united in human history, it usually generated about 30% of global GDP. So there's no question about China's ambition and China's capacity. That's what it's aiming for. Now, the key challenge is that for the last 70 years, we've been used to a unipolar world, 1/10 pole, called the United States of America. The key question now is, what do you do with China? And not far behind from China, most people don't realize that the population of India is going to exceed that of China within the next few years. And then what's going to happen to Europe? So my sense is that we're actually moving to a multipolar world. And the question then is, how do we secure the peace in a multipolar world? And which is why I come back to this issue about trying to learn the right lesson from the story of the Jewish people, an incredibly blessed and talented people, but almost always in history a minority. And if you try to impose uniform identities and try to straitjacket everyone, you end up with wars and conflict. If we accept that we are all minorities, but we all want a better world, and we have mutual respect, and we protect minorities, and yet we still have a world where we can transact, we can engage, we can interact with peace and mutual respect, we can have a golden age. So I'm not saying that just because I'm here in the AJC, but I think there is a lesson of this for the whole world from the story of the Jewish people.
Thank you for that. We'll have to continue the conversation next year when you come. Thank you.